Thank you. And thanks also to Sepideh for taking the initiative to organize this, and to everyone for showing up. I didn't quite expect so many of us. I'm going to be probably initially talking quite a bit, but feel free to interrupt with any questions, and then hopefully we can turn it into something that's a little bit more interactive. I'm going to share my screen, and yeah, you can all see this, right?
Yes.
Perfect. As you can see, there are kind of two titles, and there are kind of two ways that this can go as a result of that. There is a methodological kind of aspect to what I'm going to talk about today, which is perhaps what I would have expected to talk about the most, namely extending the diagonal line. And then there is more of an example, I guess, that comes from both Roger Caillois' work and from my own, that concerns the what you might call the lure or the allure of space. And we're going to work through this. So basically, I'm just going to outline a little bit the aims of this first, so we get some sense of what we're going to be doing for the next couple of hours. I don't really know how long this is going to run, but I would expect that I talk for, well, a while, and feel free to interrupt if you want to with any questions. Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would like us to sort of think a little bit about what this term diagonal science might mean. It's something that Caillois coins, and we're going to start there to get some kind of slight sense of it. And then we're going to maybe try using it and sort of see what it might mean as a method with the help of a case study, which is precisely of the lure of space, that which is something that Caillois talks about in an article that's called Mimicry and Legendary Psychasthenia. That is, it's wild. It's from the 1930s, if I remember correctly, and it's we're going to sort of work our way through that and read it critically in order to see if we can take some of its conclusions and ideas to kind of rework them and extend them using this diagonal method. And particularly, we're going to sort of extend it into to kind of think about what a lot of post-humanist theory does. With this, I'm talking about not so much what comes after the human, but rather sort of new materialism, affect theory, a lot of the work that has been happening in the humanities and some of the social sciences for the past maybe, I mean, I guess it's basically 30 years now. Roger Caillois is probably most known for his book Man Playing Games, but then he also wrote a book about stones and quite interesting sort of crystal formations and how they resemble human architecture and the like. In any case, I don't want to get too much into the detail. One thing that he did write was quite late in his life, a short, brief article called A New Plea for Diagonal Science. That is a little bit perhaps as a summary of some of the methods that he had been using to do his work. So I'm going to read a couple of extracts from this. One second. Nature is one. Its laws are everywhere the same, or at least they are in accord and coherent and correspond to each other in the different kingdoms, longitudes, and latitudes. Each science explores a specific segment, that is, examines a set of phenomena, data, individuals, or reactions displaying similar or parallel properties. But without being arbitrary, the limits that determine these sets often are still deceptive. In any case, they were determined to by means of a criterion that, even if it were the best one, necessarily excluded all the rest. Before classifying vertebrates as mammals, birds, batrachians, reptiles, or fish, they were grouped together according to the number of feet they had. So basically what Caillois is saying here is that the sciences they have undergone a process of rarefaction, and have been built according to more kind of specific definitions and have developed as such. But this is to the exclusion of previous sciences. Each science has its object, and it defines it in its own way. Of course, there's a lot of things that fall into cracks. So the evolution of science partly lies in the progress of its own classifications and the determination of basic and truly economical criteria, which gradually take the place of superficial characteristics that seem obvious, as one says, and are thus all the more deceptive. These mislead, divide, and delude researchers instead of guiding them toward profound, secret, and fruitful relationships. So instead of talking about how many classifying in the manner of maybe Aristotle, how many, according to how many legs, say, animals had, we are perhaps talking about something more phylogenetic relationships in biology and relationships between different at different scales, molecules, and so on. And these have changed in the history of the sciences, of course. Now, what's interesting is that from some perspectives, obsolete ways of classifying might be quite interesting, as they correspond, insofar as they correspond to real patterns in nature, even though no science really covers them. So, for instance, the number of legs something has, it's quite important if you end up being a shoemaker. In fact, it's extremely important, even if it isn't so important for any of the sciences at the moment. So with the kind of the development and the rarefaction of sciences, we seem to be losing things that fall into the gaps. And the idea of what Caillois talks about as diagonal science is to cut across different sciences in search of real patterns, as I understand it, and find them, even if they are the objects of different sciences, and maybe no science at all, but in a rigorous way, in a way that is hopefully open to some revision and kind of and in a recent way, if you will, find patterns that underlie that cut across sciences that no science alone can cover. So it's a kind of a transdisciplinary method and one that requires a certain degree of poetic skill, if you will, because we have to of course find the right resemblances and the right connections, and it requires some work. So we're going to take a look at an example of how Caillois does this in his article on mimicry. But first, I would like to tell a little bit of a story that's going to play an important role later on. Some of my friends here will have heard this, but this story takes place. It's maybe 9 years ago, in a park in Osaka, Japan. And I'm hiking there, and I come across a small family. I think it's a mother and a child, and they're looked down on the ground, and they sort of, I don't really understand what they're looking at, but as I move closer and walk by them, I see that there's a praying mantis lying on the ground, and it's cut in half, so only kind of the upper part of the body is there, except for these 2 or 3 long kind of tendrils that stick out of it and are kind of crawling on the ground as if trying to either get out or just as if its intestines or something are just there but still alive. And I didn't really know what I had seen, to be honest. And this image really stuck with me for maybe, the better part of a decade, until maybe last fall or something. I found out what it was, and it turns out that this was a species of horsehair worm. For those of you who don't know what horsehair worms do, they're a parasitic animal. They live freely in ponds of water, and essentially, when their larvae will attach to perhaps a small fly or a mosquito or something, quite harmlessly, and then the mosquito will take off into the air until they are, well, if they're fortuitously eaten by a praying mantis, The little larva will kind of will hatch out of its the egg and grow and basically eat the inside of the praying mantis. And not only will it do this, it will excrete a protein that so praying mantises navigate by they have kind of polarized light so as to avoid falling into water and so on. But the protein that the worm secretes, it changes how the mantis perceives and interacts with the polarized light, and changed it so that they're attracted to certain surfaces, notably water, and they will fly into the water and they will drown themselves as a result. So that the horsehair worm looks like this, can eat itself its way out of the mantis and find a mate and procreate. Now, apparently someone found this story a little bit disturbing. Perhaps surprisingly so. It turns out that about, if I remember correctly, about 40% of extant species are parasitic. And host manipulation, as it's called, where a parasite changes the host's behavior, is actually quite common. It's not so unusual as we might think, despite the horror story energy that's in here. Now, why do we find this story so disturbing, though? Perhaps it is because the mantis is a sort of humanoid creature already. It looks vaguely like us. It reminds us of ourselves. It connects us to insects, and as we'll see, also to plants. It tends to mimic plants itself. It has a kind of, when it stands like this. It's kind of its mere existence opens up a kind of a objectively valid relationship of basically indiscernibility between myself and the insect world and the vegetal world, between me, the mantis, and the plants that it mimics, because I am also in a way a mimic of it, an image of the mantis. I don't think, and this is one of Caillois' points that I think he makes way before someone like then it talks about the design space. This is not really a point of anthropomorphism. Precisely, it's not our fault that we look the same. It's simply that there are certain ways that certain coincidences in nature, certain solutions, such as having a face that is kind of protruding and eyes that are forward facing, that tend to be good solutions for surviving in across vastly different situations. So as the human face dissolves into otherness, we might perhaps see the resemblance. Here is an image of one like praying mantis and Hijikata Tatsumi, who I'll be talking about a little bit later. So in his article, Mimicry and Legendary Psychasthenia, Caillois takes up one of these relationships of resemblance, even a resemblance as such. He's going to he proposes a speculative explanation of mimicry, of how insects and other animals, even plants, come to look like one another and why they do so. He goes against the what one might think is biological sense to say that it's a matter of exuberance and luxury and almost dangerous luxury. We'll see why soon. I think this is probably something we can dispense with and to take some other parts of his theory more seriously. It seems that there clearly are basically argues that we find traces of mimicking animals, camouflaged animals, in the stomach of predators, so surely it doesn't work. But I mean, this is not a good argument for the simple reason that there is no such thing as a perfect defense, and had it not been been camouflaged, they might have run a greater risk of being eaten. So it just his version just doesn't check out. In any case, what he's going to do, what he does in this article, is to connect morphological, instinctual, and then interestingly anthropological examples of mimicry. And he's going to argue that all of these indicate, in the last instance, a universal allure of space, that mimicry and what it points to is something that is dangerous to life, a way of instinct of renunciation, he calls it. So just briefly, I'm going to try to work through this and kind of reconstruct this idea. Here's a so he begins this article by in kind of in great length expounding on different mimicking animals, and this is, I think, is a Kalima butterfly, an oak leaf butterfly, and here's a not a well, there's this branch, but there's also a geometer moth caterpillar on it that, at least in this image, looks quite indistinguishable. But what he's going to say, what he says is that there is in this kind of relationship of objective resemblance between the different participants in a mimicking relationship, in a relationship of mimicry, there's a certain kind of danger in that. In some other quite morbid examples, there are cases of larvae being ruined by shears, by a gardener, or even that they will kind of eat each other accidentally because they literally cannot, or even themselves, because they cannot distinguish a conspecific from the environment. So one of these larvae might accidentally sort of start munching on another one. And I mean, there's already some kind of interesting poetic things one can do with that, I suppose. But it's he takes this quite seriously. And then he goes on to say, wait, isn't mimicry also something that occurs in certain human practices and beliefs, such as in sympathetic magic, which is, I mean, a phrase that's coined by, I think it's by Fraser in the Golden Bough initially. But essentially covers two different relationships: the law of resemblance, where like affects like, such as in puppets, or maybe the popular idea of a voodoo doll, where we can take sort of an image of someone and harm it, and by doing so, harming the person. Or the same thing works for wishing luck upon others, and so on. And then there is the law of contagion, essentially, where objects essentially remember one another. So as in ritual contamination, if two things have touched, they're going to leave an kind of irrevocable trace on the other and on each other. And all of these practices, I would say, are mimetic in exactly the same way, and that animals that either look like plants or each other, or behave like them, because there's a relationship between morphology, instinctual behavior, and then also this kind of anthropological example. But he goes even further, and starts connecting this to the sense in which we can lose ourselves in our environment, because ultimately he ends up saying that the point is not that things look alike, but they take on an appearance from the environment. Because ultimately, if I am pretending or playing at being something else, that something else is also part of the environment. It's not really its kind of objecthood or its specificity that ultimately matters, but rather it is its role or place as a part of the environment, something that makes me similar to something around me. Mm-hmm. And then he says that there is something that is reminiscent of this, even in kind of our representations of space. So he's writing this article in the 1930s, and there is this Bergson-inspired psychiatrist, Eugene Minkowski, who talks about schizophrenia as basically a weakening of the vital force, la vitale, and a representation that spatializes time. He talks about the morbid geometrism, and where the patients will effectively see themselves as thinking very spatial terms and almost lose themselves in the environment. And they cannot really locate themselves. Invariably, or so Caillois claims, if one talks to a person who has schizophrenia, they might answer that, "Oh, I know where I am," or sort of, I'm lost in space, effectively. "Oh, I know where I am. It's just that I cannot find myself." This is also where he gets the title of, similarly, he gets the title of his article, Mimicry and Legendary Psychasthenia, from borrowing Genet's term, psychasthenia, which also similarly refers to a weakening of kind of a vital relationship, a weakening of consciousness, as taking a step backwards. So here he has already taken the move, essentially, to integrate representations and kind of ourselves in space into the same relationship, literally the same thing as will happen to a mimetic insect or another animal, and to sort of beliefs or practices of imitation and in magic. So connecting the dots, here are a couple of quotes as he sort of turns towards taking us to this sort of losing oneself in space idea. The feeling of personality, considered as the organism's feeling of distinction from its surroundings, of the connection between consciousness and a particular point in space, cannot fail under these conditions to be seriously undermined. All these expressions shed light on a single process, depersonalization by assimilation to space, i.e., what mimicry achieves morphologically in certain animal species, and I've added magic in forms of representation, achieve for us. We can see we're already in a kind of horror story of sorts, where all sorts of practices that with what were primarily adaptive and helped us in some way actually throw us into kind of out of ourselves and make us disappear into the world, which is one reason why this article is so tantalizing. But then he goes even further. And here we can see kind of the intimation of the idea of the diagonal line, because we're cutting across already biology and different parts of anthropology and psychiatric ideas in search of this pattern, the similar process that we don't really understand, and we're traveling further and further. So it is with represented space that the drama becomes specific, since the living creature, the organism, is no longer the origin of the coordinates, but one point among others. It is dispossessed of its privilege and literally no longer knows where to place itself. One can already recognize the characteristic scientific attitude, and indeed, it is remarkable that represented spaces are just what is multiplied by contemporary science: Finsler spaces, Fermat spaces, Riemann-Christoffel's hyperspace, abstract, generalized, open and closed spaces dense in themselves, thinned out, and so on. I'm pretty convinced that Caillois doesn't really know what he's talking about. I am no mathematician myself, but I think one immediate objection I would have to what he's saying here is that, sure, there has been a proliferation of different kinds of space in mathematics and in science, but why are these inherently any more sort of depersonalizing than even something like a Cartesian coordinate system that simply doesn't place yourself in the center? it's I mean, allocentric representations where basically we of ourselves, where we represent ourselves in relationship to another object and don't use our our own body as kind of the locus of the of our representation of space are very common in when we navigate. I mean, if I'm going to the supermarket and buy some fruit, I'm going to move myself outside of the center of space on some level, just to find my way down the stairs and across the square. And maybe that is, he would argue, a form of depersonalization. But it seems that we also know where we are in these cases. So there's something that's weird here. Here's a Riemannian manifold or something, I think. If either now or later someone has a better idea what this actually means. I mean, the key idea is that something about scientific representations and spatial representations of ourselves in space is going to contribute to exactly the same kind of diagonal line as the other examples. However, I think there's a way of making good on this that is slightly more exciting even. That has to do with basically what I suppose Husserl would call, what Husserl would have called kind of the crisis in the European sciences. Precisely the way that we conceptually end up in a situation where we lose our concept of ourselves in this, where the sciences become independent of the, if you will, humanistic concepts that they are drawn from, that serve as their foundation. For instance, Wilfrid Sellars will talk about the ascent of the scientific image and how its lack of a concept of a person and as a kind of a rational inquirer means that it cannot support itself and it needs to be somehow integrated with our manifest image view of ourselves as persons and agents that are traversing the world. It seems to me more plausible to kind of extend this diagonal line that Caillois has begun drawing by including, instead of literally spatial projections, something like the concepts that we use to remove ourselves or try to remove ourselves from the image of the world as persons. Interestingly, then this would be kind of a naturalized way, beginning with a kind of a deep history of mimicry and losing ourselves in space, to understand the unanticipated twist in the Enlightenment, as Roger Caillois calls it, when the Enlightenment naturalism turns back against its own foundations, which is noted by Husserl, it's noted by Arendt at some point, noted by Sellars, and I think, I mean, Horkheimer and Adorno's dialectic of enlightenment, at least the beginning, will at least discuss this in some way with the move of the human being out of nature. So this and how it kind of risks falling back. So this is quite an interesting thing. I mean, the price we have to pay for this is then the kind of a representation of ourselves as removing the subject, if you will, the subject of inquiry through representation amounts in some way to literally a real assimilation to the environment in exactly the same way that the body that looks too much like the background will disappear. And on some level, this is maybe true, insofar as we are to some extent what we make ourselves, and that we have a human being has some kind of ability to represent our kind of self-representation and language we use to talk about ourselves is literally a part of what and who we are. So, question is, can we go even further than this in our diagonal line? I think maybe we can. And this is where the idea of kind of the post-humanism in the social sciences and humanities kind of come in, and the critique of the these naturalistic-like critiques of subjectivity. Something happens probably around 1995, a little bit earlier, I suppose, and proceeds through the 2010s and until now, basically. It becomes quite important. My background is in human geography, so some of my examples are kind of looking towards the discipline. But I think it's certainly a general kind of trend, also in anthropology and so on. So, for instance, during Massey would argue that there's a need to kind of return to a view of space as dynamic and self-active. Nigel Thrift will argue something similar, that we are the result of kind of emergent relationships that are not simply representational. We are really embedded in the world. I mean, so these are also key tenets of active network theory, if anyone remembers that anymore. And also an important inspiration is what's been called corporeal feminism, which comes out of the work of Rosa Bardotti and Elizabeth Gross, for instance. That serve as really important influences for these ideas in at least in geography, that are a little bit more methodologically oriented. And I think this is important, the way that they're cashed out in attempts to make research. Same for parts of new materialism, and much of this leads into sort of a study of affect. Of course, in all of this, the kind of names like Deleuze and Deleuze's reading of Spinoza are very, very kind of important. So I'm not going to kind of go too deep into the philosophical underpinnings here. Because I don't think we have to. There may be more. Because what's really interesting to me here is the way that these ideas of the human being, specifically the researcher, being a part of the environment in a very kind of deeply embedded way, it seems to be an echo of what happens in the other sciences, and their perhaps desire to eliminate the inquirer from their objects. That seems to have happened, at least partially. The idea that the sciences can somehow be independent from philosophy, though in this case it's very philosophically motivated, but the outcome is perhaps similar. We can argue about that if anyone thinks differently. So basically the point I want to consider here is, and this is maybe for the people, we're using this kind of as an example, but I think for the people who are a little bit more interested in the idea of the lure of space rather than extending the diagonal line, we can consider the kind of how Caillois, whether his line can be extended to the domain of contemporary theory as a way of kind of naturalizing its effect in a similar way that I tried to do with the ascent of the scientific image. So, for instance, here, what does post-humanism, affect theory, new materialism, etc., do, rather than considering what they say that they do? For those of you who had a chance to read the Kathleen Stewart article, I mean, there are a lot of claims, and I'm getting to them, I think, in the next slide or so. But I think there's a real question about what is really achieved in a lot of calls towards a dynamic world that is full of potentiality and so on, and whether or not this happens at the expense really of the subject that proposes all of this. Yeah. So here are a couple of quotes from Stewart. The article is called "In the World That the Affect Proposed," and it's written in, I think, in 2017, right? And it's basically a recapitulation of some of the things that affect theory. For those of you who don't know it, I think it also serves as a good summary, and it's quite brief. And it also points to the way that sort of a lot of the philosophical ideas that went into what I call post-humanism and about lively space have been kind of translated into some kind of methodological research program, which is very peculiar how that happens. So affect studies offers an ethnographic method of mattering that slows to gather into an account any number of things the modernist mode of critical thinking misses. All the bodies, the lines of things on the move, the widespread joking, the sonorousness, how any line of a life vies with the unwitting and gluing, how things get started, how people try to bring things to an end, why thought as such might become an add-on or window dressing, why conceptuality might take radically different forms, or why it matters that attention sometimes slows to a halt to wait for something to take shape. And similarly, as an ethnographic method, this would be a mode of thought that tries to describe the things that also propel it. Its objects would be its subjects. Rather than fixed notions of agency, subjects, objects, bodies, and intentions, it would try to more fully describe a world under pressure, the way a present moment can descend like a curtain on a place, the way a world elaborates in prolific forms, takes off in directions, coming to roost on people and practices. And I think interestingly, in practice, a lot of this, the way that this method has worked has been through quite exuberant writing styles that really try to capture something about mirroring in writing how dynamic the world is. But if we sort of, really take the claim seriously, maybe this is not the best example, but I think we'll go with it. If we take it really seriously, there is, I think, really a question of, what happens to the form of subjectivity that proposes this. If we're really going to kind of blend into the world and see everything as forceful things, while removing supposedly antiquated modernist modes of critical thinking, or not removing or sidestepping them in some regard, where do we end up? And well, the affected subject is a person who waits in the company of others for things to arrive, one who learns to sense out what's coming and what forms it might take, one who aims to notice what crystallizes and how things ricochet and rebound in a social, natural, aesthetic ecology of compositions and thresholds of expressivity. For the affective subject, there is always the weight of the world in what can be hoped for and what must be feared, in what flourishes and what matter. So again, what might be called a very immanent view of the subject, someone who is really, really, really there as one thing among others that move around and have their own force of agency almost. So again, is this kind of turn to dynamic space does it happen at the cost of the subject in some way? I think this is an open question. I would argue that yes, it does. And that this is not a way to really disparage affect theory, but I think it really kind of achieves, discovers something interesting. A version of kind of a form of morbid geometrism, although it's better perhaps called it morbid dynamism in the humanities and social sciences that might have been otherwise only found in ideas about the hard sciences. It's kind of naturalistic worldview where really there is not such a thing as a subject that's the sort of human subject or inquirer that stands out. And again, this is really a methodology intended to be a methodological cache of the post-humanist theory. So we're supposed as researchers to really kind of blend into our surroundings in a way in order to retrieve something from them or maybe have them literally recorded on our body. I think this is what makes the line possible. So we're going to make another turn. I think I propose we take a break in a minute, but I'm going to move up to a certain point first. So just a short preamble to the next step in this argument. These are a couple of quotes from Hijikata Tatsumi, the person I showed looking like a vaguely like a praying mantis in the beginning. He was basically experimental choreographer and dancer in Japan. He notably is one of the founders of the so-called Butoh. I know some people in the room are more familiar with this kind of dance style than I am, so I apologize if I embarrass myself somehow. In any case, these quotes are from a text that I also sent out. It's called Wind Dharma. That it's from 1985, when he's quite old. And it's the first time, as far as I know, that he really talks in public about his quite interesting method of choreographing and thinking about performance. So the connection to what I just talked about is precisely the methodological kind of aspect of trying to in some way blend into the surroundings. And I would argue that there is something quite similar here that happens, or that is proposed to happen, with that is this kind of a echo, or maybe like a pre-echo, or of what occurs in pre-echo, is that a term? That occurs in post-humanist theory. So I may be weak, but that's because nothing around me has clear contours, and that's why I gravitate to mud, to Japanese poplars, and to soggy rice crackers, he would say. I felt like chopping the river. You can do that, after all, when it's frozen. So go chop the river and fetch it, and your body will quickly extend. It's the same with the sky. Think of it as a single plate, and you can shatter it. That single plate is a human plate. Smash it, and there will probably be some kind of uproar. Such extensions of the body, not necessarily delusions, will wildly increase. So here we have a kind of a similar conceptual manipulation of the human image and the human body. What's interesting about Hijikata is that, similarly to someone like Kathleen Stewart, who I quoted before, he turns this into a kind of a practice. It's quite an intricate notation system. So I'm going to link this. I found that the easiest way to sort of watch something in common on Zoom is usually to just send everyone the YouTube link and then have us take a couple of minutes to watch it. It's about 4 minutes. 4 minutes long. I'm putting it here. We can see this. But if we take like maybe if we reconvene at on the hour, we can also get a break, and I can get some more water because I'm out, and then we can kind of reconvene, and I go through the last of this, and then we talk for a bit. We can also do any questions.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. Before I say anything else, I mean, I think we can see what we're doing here. We're basically mobilizing this diagonal line and extending it so as to capture something, what was supposed to be this kind of theoretical return to the exuberance of life, and then turning it upside down into basically something that appears to do the opposite. And I think this is how the diagonal method works in a way, what makes it so interesting, because we can recognize all of these patterns and suddenly we can interpret them in a different way, which is why this is interesting. In any case, what we just watched is Hijikata's performance it's from 1972, I think. It's called Hosotan, or it's a part of it. The entire thing is over an hour long. It's part of a longer series of, it means a story of smallpox. But it's part of a longer sort of performance series where they had 4 different performances that they cycled through for sort of 27 nights in a row. And yeah, I mean, it's an example of what early Butoh looked like, at least, or could look like. And I think it's kind of nice to have a view of sort of how these sort of, this methodological idea might look like in practice. Okay. The upshot of this, and I've already hinted at it, is that the contemporary affect theorist, in a way, performs exactly the same move on themselves by exchanging the humanist view of the human being for something much more immersed in the world. They travel along the same gradient, essentially, that the praying mantis already inhabits, kind of behaviorally and morphologically. This kind of resemblance to its environment. The kind of the gradient the human mantis plant. I mean, I think there's a plausible critique here where you say, oh, but if is this a downward motion so that the plant is somehow less than an insect, and an insect is less than a human? I wouldn't necessarily say so, but I think there's a question of independence, perhaps, or one might argue autonomy from the environment. That is simply different between different species in different circumstances. I can talk more about this later, but I think I don't want to sort of imply a kind of a hierarchy where certain in any part of this line would somehow be implicitly more advanced or technical, or sort of basically I don't think we should support any sort of great chain of being, not only because it's it leads to kind of strange places that we don't want to go, and it's also incorrect. So in any case, we end up with a line perhaps that looks like this now. We've extended from biological mimicry through the kind of the idea of sympathetic magic, correspondence, and like produces like, through kind of different ideas of potentially pathological or at least unusual spatial representations. And then we veered off from Caillois' original kind of extension into representations of space that didn't place the human being at its center, towards the ascent of scientific images. And then we sort of included post-humanist theories of dynamic space that were purportedly going to sort of make space and the world lively once again, but according to this narrative, achieve something that is quite the opposite, a way of falling backwards into the environment, perhaps even losing themselves. So what? Why does any of this matter, aside from a methodological demonstration? I mean, I think it's possible to convince. One question that's interesting to me, at least, is if it's possible to convince any affect theorists or people working in new materialism that they do not want to be right. Essentially, that they don't want to achieve what they say they achieve, in the sense that do we actually want to sort of disappear in this sort of morbid sense that Caillois is talking about? I saw that someone posted sort of in the chat, sorry, I don't see the chat right now, but sort of a comparison with Freud and the idea of either the kind of sort of and regression. And I think this is something that, I mean, Caillois sets himself against quite explicitly, and he posits that there's an instinct of precisely renunciation. I think that there is something to complete here, but I think one can probably make good on it without sort of psychoanalytic theory, if one wants to. In any case, I think this would be a way to trap the proponent of new materialism or affect theorist, if one is so inclined, into a sort of horror story that they are weaving for themselves. And if we agree to this, the theorist's option is perhaps to admit that they do in fact not achieve what they say they achieve. They enact something that more like a partial sacrifice, or self-sacrifice, or partial slippage. In other words, what I mean by this is precisely that, rather than actually, because maybe this is something that has popped up in some of your in someone's mind at this point, but sort of, do they really disappear? Isn't this what you were implying, Carl? And I mean, I think the point is precisely that they don't disappear, and this is twist in the narrative. If they did what they was, if whether it be Hijikata or Kathleen Stewart in the previous example, if they did exactly what they said, then they would disappear. So there is some kind of remainder even if it's a momentary disappearance into the world, there's some way to kind of retrieve themselves, some ways to return to the manifest image or to a kind of humanism on which the limited act of disappearance and of sacrificing yourself to space depends. There's a kind of trick that goes on. So to return to the very beginning, and now we're weaving a slightly maybe the negative view of, or kind of the other side of the coin, if you will, of the narrative that I've been telling so far. Remember how the horse-haired worm kind of took control of the mantis and inhabited it by changing how it perceives light and its own environment. Is it not just so, perhaps, that the theorist, in a way, through the conceptual commitments, also take control of the human self-image? If we accept that we are to some extent who we are because of who we make ourselves through our way of talking about ourselves, does not the theorist, in a way, sacrifice her understanding of herself or the human self-image, what she is, or he is, in Hijikata's case? With the theorist, I mean, in this case, Kathleen Stewart, by the way, who serves as the unfortunate person who will have to kind of bear all of this. Sacrifice themselves in the same way that perhaps the worm acts on the mantis, by changing the conditions and sort of sending the body that is into a sacrifice while they themselves thrive. Is this not what is achieved in a way in post-humanist theory, whether it be in affect theory, new materialism, or other sort of new concepts? And this is not necessarily a bad thing. Mind that. My point is not to say that they're kind of, oh, but they're lying, they're not really disappearing, they're not really doing what they say they do. But it's precisely a transcendental point, I think, or something. It's precisely to say that we are always, perhaps, in a way, the worms that control the praying mantis, that we, in the act of making ourselves, according to some constraints, there are things we cannot sacrifice without really disappearing. And this is perhaps the other lesson we might take from something like the experiments that have happened in affect theory. Perhaps there would even depend on something like a Cartesian soul that doesn't disappear. This kind of remainder that sits in the back room and then eventually comes back, and I can write my article, and then I can publish it, and I have done effective research. I think there's a kind of philosophical lesson here that's important to keep in mind. So I don't exactly mean to disparage this any of this sort of post-humanist work. So for instance, here Hijikata and Stewart can sacrifice themselves partly because, not in spite, but sort of literally because they operate with a higher concept of themselves. They have some kind of remainder, they keep something of themselves and don't really enter into the surrounding environment. Something that controls the sacrificed body, like the worm does with the mantis. So yeah, we must consider perhaps that we are the agency, and that is only what we are, that controls kind of the human spatial gradient in a way. And that is all that we are. Okay, and then we end up with something like this. And now we can imagine that there's a little worm inside the mantis, and that there's a little thinking self inside Hijikata. And the worm and the soul, if you will, end up being quite analogous to one another. This would be the other side if there is not a literal kind of disappearance into space. In any case, yeah, so basically what I've demonstrated through this is the idea of finding, or try to demonstrate, to talk a little bit about, is finding connections between scientific objects and practices. And clearly here, the diagonal line, the very kind of constitution of it, right? It serves as a kind of seed for making connections, whether it be four-legged objects that we kind of put on this line literally, or disappearances into the surrounding world, or anything else. And I think this is where there's a slightly wider lesson that we can think about. And we've kind of moved from what is in the case we've examined here. We've moved from what people say that they do, or what appears to be the case, to kind of what it appears from the perspective that we've taken, right? So it no longer seems, if we buy this narrative at all, and we don't necessarily have to, but if we do, then suddenly affect theory and also perhaps Hijikata's dance practice appears slightly differently. The point here is that how we formulate this line, how we construct this line that runs across different entities in different sciences, different disciplines, in different areas of the world, matters a lot. And this is where I would propose it, or consider it as a method that might be used, almost a curatorial method that might be used to kind of create different, or I mean, whether it be, for me, this has been a philosophical project, but I could also see that it becomes sort of something that is cashed out artistically, or in poetry, which is, I mean, what Caillois talks about. And I'm going to end talking here because this is pretty much all I have. And I would just like to hear if anyone has any reflections on this, and sort of whether it be on the sort of my diagonal line, if that makes sense, and also this perhaps a deeper message of applying this kind of method, if there's something you've done, or where it might be helpful. I could sort of see us going into Miro eventually and sort of literally lining things up and playing with it, but we don't have to do that now. But it's thanks for listening.
Thank you so much. We'll open it for any comments. Anyone who would like to speak, please turn your camera on. If that's not possible, it's always an option to write a comment in the chat and I can read it. If anyone would like to speak.
So I don't have much of an in-depth observation at this moment, but my immediate question to all of this, especially as we're charting out this, not genealogy, but rather through line, let's say, is what happens if at any point in the chain we get to a crossroads that may potentially lead back to earlier parts of the chain, or go in different directions from the chain, if that makes any sense.
Do you have an example what that might look like?
I was trying to think of one, but unfortunately it might be a little bit messy. Let's go with the affect theory part of this for a moment, and hopefully I'll be able to land us somewhere on this. So, if affect theory, okay, let's see. Now let me just enter into this part. So, okay. One of the things in the admittedly vulgar nature of political discourse, right, is that there seems to have been a schism between the idea of, let's reductively refer to it as, consider certain groups to be humans as well, versus let non-humans thrive, and the sort of discourses that come from that sort of idea. If we come at this angle from affect theory specifically, right, where it's this idea where in order to achieve some sort of liveliness, some sort of elan, right, one must essentially diminish themselves to the environment in question, reductively understood. However, if that's in this particular diagonal reduces one to the point where you're almost nothing but the environment, with the understanding that, of course, there is always the self that is smuggled in and reprograms, then how can we understand this schism, potentially, to be able to afford, let's say, the non-human, or what is considered to be the non-human, a certain set of rights that are only understood in the system to be those that can be accounted as human, if that makes any sense.
I'm honestly not sure if I understand you entirely, but I will kind of wager that I understand it a bit, and say that probably. So two points. One more general. So let me start with that. And I think that is that whatever kind of in constructing this kind of diagonal line, I think there is an aspect of poetry, right? And I really think so. And there is a kind of a selection, an active selection that we have to make. Of course, we have probably defined something, and we've sort of located different things, and sort of we have some sense of where we're going to go. And then we include and exclude based on that, and then hopefully we sort of revise this. And I think what I've been doing here is precisely to try to revise a little bit what Caillois did in this case, right? In order to sort of to extend it a little bit tentatively and see, oh, maybe this also fits. As for the particular case of affect theory, I mean, I think for me, basically, it's difficult for me to kind of to respond to in a good way, simply because I don't think that it necessarily achieves what it sets out to achieve. In the sense that I talked about it, I don't think there is in any way, shape, or form a kind of a move beyond something that might be called the modern subject or anything like that. So this sort of, in the sense that it's, oh, we're going to include different things and treat them as human beings, I don't think that is necessarily problematic here. But I think what is the problem is precisely the activation of space itself, and thinking kind of the idea that agency, in a perhaps a stronger sense than the mere causality, is extended to a lot of things that perhaps traditionally did not have it. And the corresponding, and this is the key part, right? No matter how that is done, the corresponding passivization, if you will, of the understanding of the human being is something that is passive with respect to the environment. And I think that is where the risk kind of comes in, if that makes sense, if there is such a thing as a risk.
Would anyone, Ali?
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. I just had perhaps more like a comment on how it was, perhaps the two times personally in my life that I kind of get close to that mode of like being surrounded by space was in my early kind of childhood, growing up in a Muslim family and trying to say prayers. In a Muslim prayers is that you do it with eyes wide open, and you do very rituals that you do, like certain body gestures. And it's a sense, in a sense, that if you are paying attention to space while doing your prayers, you're not doing it right. And so as a kid, you sort of try to mimic that. And to some extent, you actually feel that, because you kind of, through this mimicry, you kind of actually get to what it promises, the sense of prayers that's supposed to get you out of your body and kind of surround you to this space. And the other one was psychedelics and LSD experience, obviously, as a kind of a mode that you just, which I had personally. At some point I felt like I'm basically an animal, and the mechanism of life is just basically how you put your feet on the stones that you're walking around, and or just your very immediate kind of arrangements, and you being in this soup of configurations and stepping on the right stone, and that's it. So yeah, I think that was for me the two times in life that it reminded me of that. But again, as you said, it's like a theory that is failing by itself. But at the same time, I think it's something that we grew out of, perhaps. So I wonder what you think of this as a process of, like, is it something that we can plug in and out, or is it something that we have to just give up on?
Thank you. I think these are also quite interesting examples to me. I think there's a lot more we could potentially add to this kind of diagonal line than what either I have added or kind of Caillois had added. Another example that just comes to mind are different types of meditation, perhaps. There's one interesting thing that I think does occur, or sort of there's one interesting tension that's kind of implicit in Caillois' article, that is between, whether assimilation to space, if you will, as a representation, something that happens, that we represent ourselves, and as it happens as a real effect. It seems to be that he implies that sort of if I perceive that I am kind of moving, sort of slipping into the environment, it's literally the same as a butterfly that looks like an oak leaf disappearing into the environment. And I think this is strange because they aren't literally the same. And I think there are probably different ways around this also, as to whether or not it's something we can plug in and out. I mean, for these experiences, I suppose that in many cases, some cases they are, in some cases they are not, and I think it's kind of yeah, there are, do we really disappear kind of question, and probably in many cases we do not, but or at least not. Yeah, there's some kind of remainder, right, as you said.
Devin, I don't know if you wanted to ask your question, if you could. If not, we'll move to Georgiana. Yes, Georgiana, please speak.
Thank you. Thanks, Carl. I would like to sit a bit with this figure, this geometrical figure of a diagonal or of a line. At the beginning of your talk, by the way, do you hear me well? Sorry.
Yes.
Thank you. That you saw it as a C for connections, as you said, and as a method to cross-cut across disciplines, to unite, well, not unite, cutting is better term. And since we're talking poetry, we have to be as condensed and as precise as possible. To me, a diagonal line, I remember in math class, when we had to do this math class, elementary math, like elementary school math, when you had to draw a diagonal of different shapes and forms, it involved a level of focus. So one dimension of it, and one aspect of doing it was this focus and of cutting through. And I was thinking maybe, or my question is whether this is treated in affect theory, with which I'm not so familiar with. And if that focus can aid your theory or a disapproval of your theory, which would be that, like a line is gives this impression of a continuous thing. and basically that it's continuously increasing activity or motion, and there's like a ratio of acceleration in it and a continuation, whereas this diagonal would be for you more of a sense of, you know, an inner sense of no doubt and a focus, rather than, you know, just a geometrical figure, a representational thing. You know, is the diagonal a representational thing, or more closer to the sense of focus? Thanks.
Thanks. That's quite a good question that I haven't really thought about so much before. I do think that it's probably both. In one way, at least, when I've been working on this project, it has been, and some others where I've tried to think in similar terms. I think the diagonal kind of functions as a way of literally like a you know, like a guide rope or something, where I can see sort of, it's going to be a very visual metaphor here, but I can kind of see one end, and I see a part of it, and then it kind of extends. I can't even see. I see a part of it in the middle, and then it's dark on each side, and I can kind of continue on each side and search. And it's extending quite like taut, and I can follow it along and then sort of see what fits and doesn't fit. Of course, I mean, in one way, the entire thing is a method of kind of limited and careful apophenia, of pattern recognition of things that aren't necessarily connected, but then trying to connect them anyway and see what fits. This is why I think it's a poetic method in many ways. And I think Caillois, who notices this himself, I think he's absolutely right about that. That it's ultimately a matter of, so the line is both sort of examined and constructed at the same time. And yes, that requires a lot of focus, because it doesn't simply pre-exist, I don't think. Or well, maybe it does, but it requires also a matter of exploration to really find the way to follow it along and see where it takes you.
And would that focus have the transcendental quality to it in a way, like how can it be summoned? And sorry if you don't have to answer this question. Someone else can.
I'm not sure if I understand it.
I'll write it in the chat, but thank you.
Sure. Cheers. Antoine.
Antoine, there's also questions in the chat from Devin and Armand.
Do you want to ask this question first?
Whoever has the ability to ask the question with their camera on in their own voice can go.
Okay. Thank you, Carl. It's an extremely stimulating presentation. I really liked it. It's a bit mind-bending, but I'll still try to ask my question. With the last question, it made me think about something that could be akin to hyperthetic. So there's synthesia, where we make things together and we advance, but maybe this kind of line diagonal puts us in a problematic situation where we can no more adjunct things together, and we only by the interest of continuing the line, we are struggling with putting on the next dot to continue the line, but that might be a call for an ability. So, and maybe there's a materialistic problem with it, because it cannot be sufficed with material block building. But the where I fit, or I'm interested in the question is picture making, obviously. But the thing now is with this problem of picture making and this kind of sphere. I've read Slaughterges this morning, so I'm completely skewed. But the thing is that the limit, the difficulty produce a limit in the line continuity, and maybe now we are, as post-human researcher or interested in this field, we are all within our imagination struggling with this new block building. It feel for me, actually, it feels like a hardship, but this hardship also like level all my capacities to say, oh, it's this, but maybe this struggling effect is a contemporary new task of setting up new checkpoints to advance.
Yeah, I think actually, as Shakshi literally right now wrote in the chat, could one also look at the diagonal as transcending this boundaries limits of disciplines and constructing a bridge to bring them together? I think emphatically, I think both Caillois' answer and mine here would be kind of yes. The thing, right, is that it's not only a matter of bridging different disciplines potentially, although this is where my focus has been here, but also perhaps a question of drawing things together that might already be quite well established in order to establish lines of communication between different fields in different areas. And this is maybe the role of the diagonal scientist, if you will. This kind of Lego block builder who sort of takes a little bit of here and there. And it's not simply, I don't think it's simply being transdisciplinary, but in a wide sense, but it's something that's a bit more specific. I mean, it's a kind of a model of a certain kind of transdisciplinary practice, right? And I think our kind of, as a whole, maybe in academia in particular, there's a slightly lazy way of talking about transdisciplinarity, and that can benefit from a lot more specificity, which is why I find this idea of a diagonal kind of line that's so tantalizing, because it really sort of, even if it's not that precise, and it leaves a little bit of leeway with how we can sort of think about it, it gives us something to guide how we're going to approach different disciplines and what we're going to do with them, and sort of what is the value of the different connections that exist between them.
Because if I'm just playing around with the parasite metaphor, if we can link all the parasite of all the agentivity within all the mantis, there is like coordination that should be next. So each parasite could aim its mantis to perceive one new aspect. But then if we coordinate all parasite, let's say in a data way, we can have more different model of parasite to see different things. Then we can rekindle the asset of all the mantis to like an eye or something that perceive more. So then all the transdisciplinary is not break apart, it's more like congruent, added together.
Yeah, or even simply finding out that there are different kinds of parasites, and maybe we are also in some sense, or we depend on some parasitism, and it's a question of classification, right? I think Caillois uses the example of three-legged things as a class. I mean, no, there's no science of three-legged things really, but of course there could also be one. And we can make it, even if it sounds, and find it something, because it's a real, and this is the crucial point, right? Because it's a real pattern. Having three legs is something, it's a real property. That's in some cases interesting. For instance, if you're in the business of making shoes, then it matters a lot.
Would Arman or Cosmos like to ask their questions? If not, I could read them aloud. Well, also Devin, there's a question from Devin about I'll paraphrase it if that's okay with you, Devin. The relation between the diagonal and a Laruelian circling back on itself. Devin writes, the sorts of eternal problems, or at least at the very least problematics, which may have previously been considered resolved, such that there is not necessarily a diagonal line, but rather a winding path that loops back on itself.
I think zooming out, yes, probably, but I think a big part of the point of this kind of metaphor of the image of the diagonal line is precisely to make something that's quite manipulable in a way. That's something that we can use in a limited context, and delimit what we're going to look for. So in this way, it's really a kind of even the image itself is a methodological light. But it's certainly there are ways that philosophy perhaps circle back on itself. The idea here is, I would say, to make things a bit easier and to guide some philosophical curation almost, or almost a kind of, it's almost a kind of taxonomy, right? It's an improvised labor of taxonomization in a novel way, and that's still interesting and meaningful in some way.
Arman writes, in The View from Nowhere, Brassier looks at the same problem through a different lens. I'm interested in your thoughts about his solution there. If we take Habermas's methodological objection to no-self theories as essentially saying what you said about the agency of the very agent who claims to be no agent, then we can translate Brassier as this, that there is a view from nowhere, in a way, that there can be said there is no self and remain consistent, for example, through Seller's collective epistemology, saying very, very roughly, human mind as such is the communal mind. Do you think that we can go from scientific image to this view from nowhere on the diagonal line? And if that is so, does the line remain the same or does it break?
To the latter question, whether the line remains the same or breaks, I think in this case it probably turns into something. This probably belongs to a slightly different line, since this line is precisely about the apparent contradictions when we try to eliminate ourselves. I think you're right, and I think Brassier is right. There's probably a, if you will, a social solution to this, but there is also perhaps a slightly more Kantian version of this, where there is a almost like a strange version of what he accuses Descartes of eliminating the condition of kind of objectifying the condition of talking about objectivity in the first place. So I mean, one thing that would be quite interesting to me is to add an older error. There's a very ending of, I'm not sure if you're familiar, might be J. Rosenberg's book, The Thinking Self. It ends basically with a note that says that, oh, the paralogisms that Kant accuses Descartes of, they're actually the most fundamental kind of instance of an older error, one that we have learned to call the naturalistic fallacy in our age, which is, of course, the reduction of, in some way, a normative concept to something different, the good into a property that is natural in some way. Originally, but more casually, simply perhaps understood as a reduction of norms to causes. And precisely if we are dependent on some kind of epistemic norms or some kind of constraints, even in order to kind of formulate knowledge and to make ourselves into agents, it seems that there would be a limit at which we even eliminate this capacity. But of course, this is a speculative horror story almost at this point. But I think it works nicely as a counterfactual. The other thing I would say here is that I think what's interesting about this line here is precisely that it's a way of naturalizing the entire kind of problematic of the that comes with the view from nowhere. It really becomes a really kind of something that has a natural history, that has things that precede it, such as certain accidental events in camouflage in nature. And I think that's maybe the most interesting aspect of this, that at least in some ways.
If anyone would like to speak, they may. Otherwise, I will read this question from Cosmos. I wonder how can you apply the diagonal method in temporal terms? It seems that you are accessing the spatial diagonal line temporally straight. So how could we diagonalize the access to the diagonal? Also, what are the similarities and differences between the diagonal and the rhizomatic method?
Well, I mean, again, to the last question, I think they are probably as very almost opposed. I would say that Deleuze and Guattari would probably throw 1,000 plateaus in my head, which is a big book, and it would hurt. Because this is very much like I think this is very much kind of a top-down root tree situation. I think specifically because it's, I mean, it's really a way of constructing, of kind of selecting for objects for a new kind of taxon, almost Aristotelian classification. So probably very different. I would suspect. Maybe there's a way of bridging that difference. I don't know. In one way, I think this is actually what makes this approach so strangely radical in this moment, because it's so almost, I wouldn't say conservative, but it's also old-fashioned. As for how I can apply it in temporal terms, I would say that maybe the easiest way to talk about that in this example is to think about it in terms of a natural history or something like this. You could almost, even if there's no kind of phylogenetic, okay, maybe there's a relationship to something rhizomatic here, but maybe there's no kind of phylogenetic relationship between all of these. They come from different sources, but nevertheless, they kind of instantiate issues that are similar. They are a kind of a recurrent pattern that arises at different moments in time. Kind of like echoes going throughout, sort of moving throughout nature. There's my face, there's the face of the praying mantis. There's also a face-shaped rock somewhere in my vicinity, and a tree that looks a little bit like me. And then there's Jesus in a piece of toast. And the resemblance is real. It would be the point here, and I can kind of classify them. Of course, they appeared through different processes and at different moments in time.
Thank you. The floor is open if anyone would like to make any questions or comments. I could say something. Devin, please.
No, Maure, please go on first.
I was going to simply ask if, Carl, you had any thoughts on the passage on Flaubert in Mimicry and Legendary Psychasthenia, or if you thought that that passage was applicable to Flaubert's statements about writing, and then your comments on writing style. I'm thinking of Flaubert's famous comments about being Bovary, but also in correspondences with Louise Colette, becoming God. What kind of God, I don't know. But people say that he was reading the Isha Upanishads at the time.
I have a very simple answer to this. It's that I don't know Flaubert well enough to say anything interesting. I would really appreciate if you could actually after this send me some of these connections, because I do think, I mean, Caillois included it here, so there is probably something to be explored. I think sort of quite frankly, in my focus on this, I've been looking elsewhere. Clearly also at the different sort of artistic and literary practices, such as Hijikata in this case, but there are also some remarks by Artaud, interestingly, I think, that pertain to this, although in a slightly different way. So I think there's probably a quite a rich literature, kind of a domain of literature, literary history that could kind of be incorporated here. And it's something I would be, really interested in sort of following up with, or something, or anything with it.
Thank you. Devin, please speak.
Yeah, I was wondering in relation to this diagonal method, whether we might hypothetically, or sorry, theoretically maybe diagonalize the diagonal method um, such that we're left with this this sort of path that's not necessarily diagonal, but still follows a diagonal trajectory, and it's sort of dotted with these attractors. If you see in like the image that I sent, which facilitate the diagonalization and can also help sort of address this recursivity that appears within philosophy and within this sort of diagonal method, as you've touched on.
This is interesting because there's especially actually even in respect to this text that we with to Mimicry and Legendary Psychasthenia. There's a letter from Adorno to Walter Benjamin where he basically accuses Caillois in a different text on praying mantises, as it were, of basically throwing all of cultural history into a part of natural history, and this, according to Adorno, makes him a kind of a proto-fascist. I don't necessarily remember exactly how, but those of you who know Adorno a bit better than I do might understand why that is. In any case, basically what that entails then, if Adorno is right about this, is that Caillois maybe in a way, if the kind of the naturalizing gesture itself is problematic in a way of kind of edging towards an assimilation to space, then it would mean that Caillois, even in writing this and in kind of drawing this diagonal line, he performs precisely the problem that he also performs the problem that he's talking about. Which is quite interesting. As for the trajectory the image that you linked, I mean, I'm not sure if I understand it fully, but I think one thing that would be just interesting maybe to experiment with for anyone here, I guess, would be to think of, what would it be if we had a different kind of line, a kind of a parable of some kind, or whatever, and see sort of would that, just as a kind of an image to work through or across even, what could be done with that. And I think there is even to these almost childish little games with as guidelines for methods or images, I think they can do quite a lot to help us organize our explorations. And I mean, again, even with the last encounter with kind of the rhizome, it's such a simple image that still leads them to quite a lot of, and there's many people after them also to do a lot of interesting work. So I would go with it if I were to and see where you end up.
Would anyone else like to speak or ask any questions? Or Carl, would you like to say a little bit about your thoughts on you suggested some diagramming as the next step?
Yeah, I mean, if anyone wants to do it, I think, I mean, if we have Miro space, it would be interesting to sort of see. I mean, it's not something we'll have to do together, but it would be interesting if to see this method used a little bit. If anyone wants to play with it, I would kind of, yeah, I would suggest this as an activity. I mean, it's not something we have to reconvene about, but if anyone wants to, we could also organize something in the Discord and sort of talk about this. And it doesn't have to be necessarily a diagonal line, but thinking about these very simple guiding images for as transdisciplinary methods, basically. And I think there could be a lot done with that. So with that in mind, I think hopefully this session has been a little bit of a suggestive step to maybe help us think a little bit about what that might look like.
Well, thank you. I personally have to go now. I don't know if you want to start closing up or if you want to leave any more space.
I can leave a little bit of space, and if anyone else has a question, and then sort of when everyone feels happy, we can just go about our respective days. And but yeah, thanks for moderating and organizing this morning.
Thank you. I'll head out then, but please continue.
Hello, Reza.
Hello, everyone. Just wanted to thank Sepideh and Maure and everyone else who, organized this. And thank you so much, Carl, and everyone for magnificent conversations. Just like a few things, just top of my mind. First of all, magnificent talk. I'm just trying to digest a number of things at the same time. So yeah, just like going through some of the questions that people asked. The first one was Georgiana, caught my attention, was saying that, well, the diagonal, is it a matter of more of a focus or is a matter of representation, to what extent, so on and so forth. And then Georgiana brought up, elementary geometry example, which is magnificent, right? The thing is that when we look at Euclid elements, the construction of a diagonal line in Euclid obviously is based on certain sorts of implicit definitions, implicit instructions, explicit instructions, and so on and so forth. It's a mixture of all of them. But nevertheless, there is always, precisely because of the diagrammatic nature of Euclidean elements, there is an element, even in the axiomatics of it, that there is an element of intuitive or intuition, right? Meaning that when you are making a diagram of a square, right, you need to exercise a lot of intuitive focus, like a Buddhist, to make sure that you actually create the right diagonal, right? Except then this becomes, at least in geometry, then it becomes a certain sort of, I don't know, a bane at some point, where basically different sort of philosophers and geometers start to say that, well, this sort of intuitiveness, this sort of intuitive focus that goes into creating a diagram, maybe it's not really genuinely a focus, because even with the instruction, with the representational instructions of how to make a diagonal line, or make a circle, or make a square, or a triangle, you still can actually make, as Proclus said, you can make a triangle with 4 sides. You can make a circle that looks like a square. You can do all sorts of things which actually doesn't look like Euclid's things. So then we have in mathematics, in a way that they assimilate this focus into their intuitive transcendental mechanism. And yes, it is absolutely transcendental to make a diagonal line, precisely because it requires the intuitive focus and also the representational element, which is no longer representational in the pictorial sense, but rather representational in a fundamentally abstract mathematical sense, right? But then we see that, for example, with Descartes, algebra is supposed to assimilate that focus into the task of the representation itself. But yes, so I think diagonal is actually the line which we can call the symbol of transcendental philosophy.
That's quite interesting, actually. It's also both on the sort of more formalized sense that you're talking about it here, But also I think just in terms of of course, Caillois is talking about something slightly more casual when he's talking about the diagonal line. But I think there's something to this, and moving it towards an image also of transcendental philosophy. Because yeah, you're right, and in this sense, I think you're also, both you and Georgiana are right here in that there is something transcendental that is, there are some sort of constraints that we have to accept in order to even draw this line, whether it be and I think this applies even in the more sort of casual sense, of vernacular sense that Caillois is talking about, precisely because of the kind of the image of the diagonal line that we need to utilize. One thing that is perhaps interesting here is transcendental with respect to what, right?
Yes, the context needs to be, but I think that precisely it's transcendental precisely because it's diagonal, meaning that it's transcendental with regard to everything: mathematics, geometry, religion, philosophy, everything.
Yeah, exactly. It's a kind of and this also makes it interesting, especially if one is inclined to think that anything transcendental has precisely it's transcendental specifically in respect to physics, sort of post-Newtonian physics would have particular sort of transcendental structures that condition them. And another kind of cognition would have perhaps a different set of transcendental structures that condition them. So then, what precisely are the conditions that would enable this sort of cross-cutting gesture through different sides?
Cutting across. Yes, cutting across. Well, basically, Georgiana was saying that, look, it's not connecting, but rather cutting across.
Yes.
It's really a line that cuts across. Yeah, and in a sense that by cutting across, it does, the ultimate philosophy called gesture, articulation and disarticulation, in a sense of Platonic, cutting at the joints when necessary, but also essentially explaining things by disarticulating them. Slices of reality.
Yeah, no,
or slices of history, whatever you might call them.
Precisely. I'm gonna ask if anyone else wants to jump into this conversation. Just to
Fruit ninja philosophy. Then there was another one that I think that Devin that talked about it with regard to Ray's the view from nowhere, right? The scientific image and the view from nowhere, and the self. I mean, this has been brought up. Obviously, I don't know whether Ray actually believes in this anymore. Considering that he's in his conversation with Metzinger, I don't think that he does. Precisely because Metzinger's view from nowhere that he partially adopts in that old essay in 2012, it's about phenomenal self, right? It's a phenomenal self that is being dissolved, right? But obviously, a rationalist, Brazier, would say that, well, the phenomenal self is not really the kernel self of Kantian or Hegelian agency. It's not a conceptual agency, so to speak. It's not a rational agency. So, we can go away, we can do away with phenomenal self model in a Metzingerian sense. But then I think I don't think that you can actually go forego with phenomenal self either. No, you can talk about it, you can explain about it, but you can make it transparent. It's vicious transparency, hence opacity. But I don't think that you can do away with it.
But Metzinger doesn't think so either, if I remember correctly. I do think he
yes,
says we cannot be convinced that it doesn't exist.
Yes. But nevertheless, as you have, I mean, particularly that in that conversation that he has with Ray in what was that conventions, arena or something, I can't remember. He is kind of like, you know, trying to double down on his, you know, that no, we can actually do away with it. And we are going to embrace nihilism at this point. And then, you know, Ray famously says that, well, you know, if you do that, then you will risk a thoroughgoing nihilism.
No, yes.
And finally, my question, this is a little bit surprising, might be for you. So you talked about diagonal sciences, right? Extending from biology or physics, biology, and then to, I don't know, post-humanism, right? And then what you put behind that was the so-called universal allure of a space. And, you know, the renunciation, right? It's not really a question, rather it is, I want to ask you about this. So you also talked about the conceptual languages, meaning that this diagonal line historically, if we look at it temporally, as people talked about it historically, it moves toward a certain sort of conceptual, what you might call to be a slices, right? Where basically we are no longer talking about a space and bodies, right? A space and self, or a space and ego in a Freudian sense, or in Metzingerian sense, or, you know, these parasitoids, but in terms of conceptual spaces, right? And if the moment that conceptual spaces come, I don't think the diagonal line culminates in something like post-humanism. In fact, diagonal line becomes extremely twisted at this point, given the fact that it cuts across various historical slices of reality. Then you get something like, you know, as we have talked about it, an Islamic hyper-camouflaged agent. We talked about it on our own Discord and other, you know, the TV series Veil. Essentially, an agent who truly mimics in the fundamental sense, not merely dissimulating, mimics in your sense, in the Caillois sense, mimics all attitudes of a, you know, of an oppressor, right? Mimics them and then infiltrates their society. So at this point, when we are entering the realm of politics, militarization, society, clash, and so on and so forth, how can we exactly talk about this sort of phenomena with regard to a space? Because this is a space that these people are working on obviously has something to do with, you know, the biological patterns and all the diagonal line, but also it's very specific sort of a space, precisely because it's militarized. It is absolutely done by choice, by certain sorts of factors, and it's done perfectly, right? At this point, you know, of course, there is denunciation, renunciation of the self, right? Renunciation of the self. And you see it, for example, ISIS, I don't know, Shia martyrdom, right? Shia taqiyya, hyper camouflage. They go to a different society, doing this sort of mimicry, dissolving themselves to the environment, but nevertheless, it is by choice, and that the renunciation is not simply a renunciation to a natural space, but rather martyrdom, renunciation of the self to God, right? It's kind of like bizarre sort of, you know, twisted end of the diagonal line, I would say.
Yeah, I would say potentially. Because there is one thing, I didn't want to get into it in this presentation, because I think the big question here is what is renounced?
Yes.
And for Caillois, it would be kind of life itself, but this is absurd. This makes no sense, because this kind of supposes in a way a kind of great chain of being narrative, that you would renounce yourself and become more insect-like or more plant-like and then more rock-like or whatever. We cannot accept this. And so the question is then, since that a lot hinges on the possibility of finding some kind of concept that introduces some kind of directionality, something that is quantifiable in nature. And for me, I think the answer would be autonomy, in the kind of the broadest biological sense imaginable, where it pertains to both like a physical kind of separation from the environment and also kind of a freedom of action and kind of behavioral flexibility. And I think this is what is potentially sacrificed, the kind of the binding, the other side of the kind of the binding that binds the line together. Because what is given up in all of these cases, and perhaps also including in the case of the hyper camouflaging extremists, it might be that they lose something of their own ability and freedom to act. Because precisely to blend in, it means restricting oneself to the rules of the game. And suddenly there is a new level of constraints that has been introduced that wasn't there before. Of course, autonomy is a tricky thing, because it's very different to kind of difficult to operationalize. And is a snake more autonomous than a sea urchin? I don't know. It probably is, but it's certainly not better to be a snake than a sea urchin. But I mean, in more intricate cases, it's difficult to measure. I mean, incidentally, I think this is also one critique that could be leveraged against people like I'm going to say Nick Land, who would really kind of purport to make themselves almost a force of nature in order to you know, the literal becoming sea snail or something like this. Yeah, I think this would be my simple answer, that we have to sort of know what we are plotting on.
I will say something, but Georgiana wants to say something first.
Yes, please.
Yeah, both of your conversations, although I admit perhaps I didn't catch the full profundity of it, but it did make Reza, the situations you were introducing, the militarized space and so on, made me return to Roger Caillois' text and to Maure's question about, or his reference to Flaubert, because I happened to read his, I have a fresh reading of his books and journals, and yeah, I mean the temptation of Saint Anthony, which is the biblical story, of course, is also like an example of Flaubert's later work, which is kind of like, I don't know if you want to include it in a genre, magical realism sort of thing, although literary historians, or let's say there's some taxonomy in literary history, and that is also not updated, I would say. And I think Caillois read also a bit of romantic pantheism in Flaubert's novella. And but I was thinking about the statement that Flaubert made, which was, I want to write a novel about nothing. But of course, in writing about nothing, you have to have that sense of direction, selection. I mean, it's quite hard, actually, because if you want to write a novel about something, then you say, okay, I want to write a novel about this period and this period. But I think he wanted to say that I want to write a novel that dispenses with the plot and lets me blend in camouflage inside words and let the plot, the characters disappear in this complete work of literature that I'm creating on one hand. And of course, the supplices, the efforts Antoine, Saint Anthony, fights, endures in the biblical scene. Of course, it's an analogy to Flaubert's creation process itself, but also could be a way of cross-cutting, like it's this portrayal of selection, of choosing, of opting for something, because that's what happens when you're tempted by demons. You have to choose whenever they invite themselves in unannounced, and deliberately so, unannounced, to piss off your peace or faith. Yeah, so yeah, that was my my addition to your conversation.
Excellent, Georgiana. Yes, yeah, Flaubert's, yes. So last thing that Carl, you mentioned, I mean, coming back to the Islamic hyper-camouflage, the doctrine of taqiyya, and, as a fundamental form of, I mean, there are good reasons that, people have been talking about John Carpenter's The Thing, right, with regard to these, but also capitalism as a fundamental form of mimicry, right? Remember the ending scene of John Carpenter's The Thing? It's MacReady and his friend, I forgot his name. The entire camp has been blown apart, and they are just like, in the cold. None of them wants to actually fall asleep because they are suspecting that the other one is the thing. Except the ending is quite ambiguous. Not only that they are paranoid that the other person might be the thing, this hyper-camouflaged sort of thing, but rather that what if I am the thing and I don't know it, right? And then coming back to that thing that you said, the sieve metaphor, right? So, for example, how does the sieve work for something like that? For an instance of this Islamic hyper camouflage, or for the thing in itself, in the John Carpenter's horror movie lore, a kind of complete overlap, hyper camouflage.
Yeah, I think, I mean, there are definitely different dangers here, right? It's either that you collect too many things inside the sieve, that your holes are too big in a way, that you let too many things through that wouldn't normally really belong. And this is why it's intriguing to me, the kind of the strictness of the straight line, that you cannot really permit yourself to bend it too much, because then you're really kind of falling too deep into some kind of apophenic organization of everything onto it. And this is itself a kind of philosophical, I might even call it a kind of philosophical madness, where we think that everything too much is the same. But then there is also the other risk, right? That we make the holes too small, and we miss a lot of things that we would. And this is arguably what a lot of sciences in their kind of progression towards verifying their objects fall prey to. In certain cases, we end up with something that's too narrow, and doesn't let all of the interesting things, all the instances of something through. And I think the only way past this is a kind of, I mean, probably talking about it to other people. There's a kind of there's an intersubjective dimension to this practice, I think. But it's important. I do think it's we kind of reemphasize the significance of kind of almost the poetic aspect of this as a kind of an attempt to negotiate and really find these real patterns and being prepared to throw out the things that don't really fit in the end, and also continuous course correction.
I think also there's also like the opposite of the thing as well, in the sense that you think that you're the one, but you're not actually the one. So in this way, you could almost do like sort of like the antonym to like the messianic figure in Blade Runner 2049. So Joe, the figure in 2049, thinks that he's the one, right? And there's all these different signs that point to that fact. But then there's that poignant scene at the end where he finally finds the revolutionaries, and they sort of point to the fact that, oh, like this is a process that everyone goes through where they think they're the one. They think that they're Neo or the Messiah. So I wonder if there needs to be some sort of like the diagonal line is made like helix, like a helix, like a Mobius, in the sense that it gives it dimensionality. So not only is it a diagonal line, but maybe it's like a diagonal twist or a diagonal Mobius, in the sense that it is going somewhere. But it's always in this. I think this is the role of the aphorism, in the sense of like maybe a Nietzschean ethic. The aphorism is something that sort of it breaks from the law of equivalence, and it's more like it works within ambiguity. So I wonder if these two things need to constantly be twisting on each other, and you can have something like a hyper camouflaged agent, but it's always going to be connected by like an incomputable or something. There's something that's connecting it, but it doesn't. I don't know if that space can be filled. Like, what is the thing that's connecting it? Is this like a kind of singularity or something like this?
Maybe one of the things that might be worth mentioning also is sort of that at different points of I mean, there could conceivably be branches along this thing. They discover different regions that then you go off and explore them in their own, coming from this direction, right? You examine this thing, and suddenly you have a lot of phenomena. They appear to be different than they were before. I think this is maybe the real sort of strength of this method is that you classify a bunch of things that you thought you knew what they were, and suddenly they appear to be different than they were before because you put them in this new context. It's like almost like you're rearranging the room, and suddenly, oh, I put this bottle next to my tennis ball, and oh, it's a kind of a work of art, or if there are two tennis balls, it looks like a penis or something suddenly, and it didn't before. And I think this is the importance of the method, and then you can kind of go from there, because this thing that you put there in this new kind of assemblage, it really is that thing too, in the sense that, yeah, I'm also a two-legged object, and suddenly I can treat myself as that, and kind of go and explore myself as a two-legged object as a result of this reframing. So I think that's a big kind of possibility that's opened up. Yeah, thanks.
Aren't we talking about something like an hypermodel? It seems that we're talking about something that we would like to be an object, but it's more like an hyper object, but not like the object perceived, but maybe something that we want to build, like hyper modelization. It seems that I would like that too as a direction.
What does that mean?
If we're farther than what we can describe, because we are embedded into this kind of impossibility to get at, because there's like an end of the ontology, or it seems then it's not a simple model of the thing we can describe even topologically, but then it can be akin to an hypermodel where it needs more than one agent to always grasp something each time dynamically. So it's not simply a model that you can remodelize from yourself. Then it's an hypermodel. That always need more than the model to be modelized. Yeah, maybe not.
I'm honestly not sure. I think there's a question of the sort of trying to track something that could be sort of seen as a real pattern, right? But I think there's kind of a distinction between what we're talking about, if we're talking about the line as the sort of the line itself as the object here, or if we're talking about the objects that then happen to be placed alongside, that we place alongside the line in our discoveries. Right. Okay. Anyone else? Because I don't think we should go too much over 2.5 hours for this, probably. Oh, wait. Yeah. So if anyone else has any sort of questions or thoughts to round this off. Okay.
Oh,
yeah, please,
sorry. I think in relation to how we are conceptualizing the diagonalization, I think that the simplistic, the metaphor of the line certainly serves a purpose, but also by complexifying it or sort of diagonalizing the diagonal, we can perhaps arrive at more interesting structures that capture some underlying dynamics better. So, for example, like with the analogy of like a spinor or the winding sort of path of that is dotted with sort of these local minima or attractors, we can sort of realize maybe a little bit better how you might progress through the diagonalization and sort of find yourself in various local attractors, despite the overall system having a diagonal trajectory. And then, of course, if we think in higher dimensions in terms of like the spinors or the Mobius strip, we can also realize some interesting comparisons there.
I think that's fair, and it's sort of I think I see what you're saying, and also what Antoine was saying now a little bit better. I think there's another interesting distinction. Maybe I already made it, but I think and that's the question of the line as a fundamentally methodological. It's something, whether it's something that we draw or if it's something that's there. Clearly, the line. I tend to think of it as something that is drawn. It's a kind of an act. It's a kind of a sieving through. But then it draws through a kind of space, right? We draw it through a space of real resemblances in some way that we have defined, or that we are kind of continuously updating what they might be, or expanding and contracting depending on where the line goes, maybe. And this might be a kind of a higher dimensional situation, right? Whereas the line is itself it's something that simply cuts through it, and it's something that's very explicitly constructed in order to bring something down from this heaven, if that makes sense. I think that's maybe a helpful way of thinking about it.
Yes, certainly. Do you see a distinction between like the drawing of the diagonal line and a sort of like drawing of a specific function, or like a mathematical function that would equivalently resemble the diagonal line, just maybe in a different format?
Maybe. I don't. I probably need to sit with that a little bit, in the sense that I haven't. It's funny because I went into this and sort of, oh, the diagonal line. It's how complicated can it be? It's just a line. But if there's one thing that sort of talking to everyone has sort of made it done for me, it's sort of there is definitely a room to conceptualize this gesture, this kind of methodological gesture, a lot more. I simply just lifted it from Caillois' phrasing. I'm like, oh yeah, that's a good metaphor. But I think it's doing a lot of kind of work for everyone here. That's worth staying with, and I would also like to think a little bit more about it. But yeah, essentially, yeah, I think that's where I'm at this point. Okay, I would say that's pretty perfect. And for those of you who are still here 2.5 hours later, I would just like to say thank you. Thank you for showing up and for listening and asking questions and yeah, just being here. And yeah, that's it for me this time around.
Thank
you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carl. That was great. Really appreciated it.
Cheers.